So, apart from all these undoubted authorities, which Rancé quotes to support this clearly contentious issue, who is the main source to whom he looks for his authority in demanding this strict vegetarianism? Well, I quote Rancé, "Who can better inform us of what was really in the mind of St. Benedict on this matter than the holy founders of the Order of Cito? God chose them," he says, "to re-establish the rule of this great saint, which is no longer being practiced and no longer known, and to bring its spirit back to life." And so what did they do? They rejected every meaning and interpretation that did not conform to the purity of the rule, and began, says Rancé, and there's truth in this, and began by foregoing the permission to eat meat byproducts, anything associated with meat, which had been granted by a council held at Aix-la-Chapelle in 817. Now, that will not be familiar to you, so let me just tell you what had happened there. There was a council of Benedictine abbots, obviously Benedictine because it's before the Cistercians had come into being, in 817, and they had to discuss the question of the rule of St. Benedict and the eating of meat. Now, fair enough, they found the eating of four-footed creatures was not particularly common. Occasionally there were lapses, but for the most part that was not a problem. But the monks were taking great advantage of the fact that they were not prohibited from eating poultry, and chickens were being eaten right, left and centre. And they found, I'm quoting Rancé here, they found the eating of poultry so general and so widespread throughout the order of St. Benedict that they thought, quite simply, they daren't stop it, but they tried to limit it. In other words, this is if we try to stop it, we're going to have rebellion on our hands. Well, we can perhaps reduce it. And so they therefore, I'm quoting here from Rancé, they therefore gave instructions that on the feasts of the Nativity, that's Christmas and Easter, the brothers might be given poultry to eat, provided they did not regard this permission as an obligation. In other words, if they were offered poultry, they didn't have to eat it, but they might be offered it, and provided that the abbot and the brothers would abstain from it if they thought it proper. But on those feasts, on the big feasts, the major feasts of Christmas and Easter, they could be given poultry to eat. And the early fathers of Cito, says Rancé, rejected that view. They were not going to go along with that. And he quotes the various texts on the early documents in which either this is stated or at least, he says, implied. They demanded, the early founders of Cito he's talking about here, they demanded strict and absolute abstinence from all meat, making no distinction or differentiation between poultry and four-footed animals. In other words, what Rancé is saying here is not only am I going back to a greater purity in the rules of St. Benedict, I am simply following in the footsteps of the founders of our very own order. In other words, did St. Bernard eat chicken? No, he did not. Did he eat cows? No, he did not. And so on and so on and so on. And we know, he says, when Bernard was really sick, which he was quite at the time, how he did not wish to have any mitigations at all if he could avoid it in his diet, unless he was actually commanded to do so. And so, Rancé does demand, in this case and in other cases, a stricter interpretation of the rule than Benedict. Where does this stricter interpretation of the rule come from? If you can remember anything at all of what I mentioned to you before, you know where it comes from. The DF, the Desert Fathers. who had such a deep and profound influence on Rancé, and particularly one of them, John of the Ladder, St. John Climacus. Rancé loved those hard and leathery ascetics. He just loved them. And his favourite was certainly Climacus, John of the Ladder. And John of the Ladder, says Rancé, I'm quoting now, he was a man who knew exactly what it was to be directed by grace, says Rancé. John was someone, again I'm quoting, who had penetrated the depths of the duties of the monastic life more than anyone else. John, he says, I'm quoting, was unquestionably the greatest and most enlightened solitary ever to appear in the Church of God. Listen to that. Unquestionably the greatest and most enlightened solitary ever to appear in the Church of God. That's John of the Ladder. You can understand, therefore, that the spirit of John of the Ladder is going to influence Rancé's interpretation. It could not do else. He was sort of, when he had converted, this is the stuff he was reading at Veretz before he entered La Trappe. We know, because we know what he was reading at that time. He was deeply, deeply, deeply influenced by these people, and he really loved them. And so, it's true that the spirituality of the rule is deeply influenced by the spirituality of the Desert Fathers. But the spirituality of the ladder of divine ascent, the spirituality of St. John of the Ladder, is not the spirituality of St. Benedict. It's not the spirituality of Benedict. There are major areas of overlap. There's no question about that. There are certainly major areas of overlap. Three examples. Humility, obedience, prayer, and there are many others. But the emphasis is totally different. The ladder of divine ascent is not a manual for living the communal life, the cenobitic life, the life in community. It isn't. It is not a guide to life in a monastic community. The rule of St. Benedict is. But there is, as I say, no doubt that for Rancé, his own spirituality, and as far as he was concerned, the spirit of the rule, not the letter, the spirit of the rule of St. Benedict was deeply influenced by the heat and the fervour of the desert. He wrote a conference, I'm not going to bother with if you want, it's actually available in English translation. He delivered a conference on Benedict for the Feast of St. Benedict. And it's interesting that the conference begins by comparing Benedict with Anthony the Great. Benedict appears as a sort of second Anthony. This will not surprise us. And in this conference we see the way in which Rancé sees St. Benedict and the Benedictine rule as deriving from Anthony the Great and all the other great teachers of the desert. We do. What we see also in this conference is a great emphasis on how Christians in general and monks and nuns in particular have fallen away from not so much just the teachings of Benedict, not so much the teachings of the Desert Fathers, but from the source of those teachings. Where do we find the source of the teaching on humility? Where do we find the source of the teaching on obedience? Where do we find the source of the teaching on penance? Where do we find the source of the teaching on love your neighbour? Where do we find the source of the teaching on all these things? We find it in the words of Christ himself in the Gospels. In other words, people have fallen away from the teachings of Christ. And if monks have fallen away from the teachings of St. Benedict, they have also fallen away from the teachings of Christ, and they no longer deserve, in fact, to be called Christian. And the third thing we see in this conference, which is a fairly lengthy conference, it would have taken about anything from, say, 50 minutes to an hour to deliver, depending how fast it spoke. The third thing we see in this conference, again, we don't need to go into detail, is Rancé's emphasis on bringing back the rule of St. Benedict, as Julian Paris said it should be done. How do you restore the order to its first spirit? Bring back the rule of St. Benedict. But what Rancé is saying is bring back the spirit of that rule, not just the letter of it. He is not emphasized. People were wrong when saying he was iron-bound to the letter of the rule. No, he was not. As you have seen, as I've mentioned to you now over these last few minutes, there are some parts of the rule may be changed, some parts of the rule must be changed. There are, he says, interior demands and exterior demands. Some of these pertain to the very essence of the rule itself, and under no circumstances can they be amended. Under no circumstances can they be dispensed with. Others can be, however. But who does the dispensing? Who does the changing? Not the individual monk or nun. That's the thing. Not the individual religious. It is not the business of any individual monk or any individual nun who may not like a particular part of the rule, or may find a part of the rule difficult, or may find a certain part of the rule really difficult to keep, to change it. That is not their business. They have no authority to do this. They have no right to do this. They have no privilege to do this. There's only one person who can amend, change, or deviate from the rule for very, very, very good reasons, and that is the superior, the abbot or the abbess. And this, of course, puts a huge responsibility on the abbot or the abbess, and requires that they have a very deep discernment as to what is necessary, what needs to be done for a community, and what needs to be done in individual cases in that community. Some abbots had it. Rancé undoubtedly had that discernment in his relationship with his individual monks. As I've said many times before, their visitors were noted the attention that he gave them, and the loving care that he gave them, and their response, their joyful response to this loving care. He was with them all the time. He took their problems, their difficulties, their troubles very, very serious indeed. And one writer says, even when he gave them permission to go to another person to confess, to make their confession, they did not want to. They wanted to come to Rancé to confess, because he had that discernment, something which was shared by the curé d'Ars in a later time, to see into the heart and to guide them with that discernment on the path which would lead them to a greater purity, and indeed to a greater resonance with the spirit, not the letter, of the rule that they were following. Not all abbots had that, not all abbots have that, and the same is true of abbesses. We have some wonderful abbesses at the time, and we have some who were, let us say, not quite so wonderful. Of course, that's the way, and the reason for that is because they are, all of us, frail human beings, and sometimes, of course, we are less images of God than we should be. So much for the rule. So much for the rule. I want now to talk about, not at length, but something different before I conclude these conferences. A different side of Rancé. So far, I've tried to point out where some misunderstandings occurred, but there is no doubt that the Rancé who was perceived outside the cloister was a stern, austere, ascetic figure. And you can see, in fact, from portraits of him at the time, he looks like a stern, austere, ascetic figure. He really does. Not the sort of man you want to mess with. And what we hear about is his insistence on the spirit of the rule of St. Benedict. We see the bad side of Rancé, for example, in his conflict with Guillaume Le Roy on the matter of humiliations. We see sometimes an opinionated, self-righteous man who was easy, who took offence easily, who did not take criticism kindly, who hated to be attacked on anything, and who, if he was attacked, was immediately ready to attack back. No question about it. There is another side of Rancé, a tender side of Rancé, which we've glimpsed in his relationship with his monks, and the love they had for him and the love he had for them. That's the much more tender side of Rancé. And there's another tender side of Rancé, which is revealed in his attitude to the Virgin Mary, to the Mother of God, to, I'm going to use a Greek term here, Theotokos, the God-bearer, for a reason which will become clear in just a moment. So what I'm going to talk about now is something which is also misunderstood. Rancé has sometimes been accused of ignoring the Virgin. A number of writers, not least Alban Crailsheimer himself, on whom be peace. Alban Crailsheimer has said that it is remarkable that Rancé says so little about the Virgin Mary. And others have made the criticism that at La Trappe, one of the things that seems to be missing is any devotion to the Virgin Mary, which, after all, is a key to the Cistercian tradition. As all of you know, all Cistercians know, every abbey must be dedicated to the Virgin, although it may be dedicated to others as well, but unquestionably, first and foremost, to the Virgin Mary. So where is it? Why do we have no Virgin at La Trappe? Why is Mary neglected at La Trappe? And the answer is, she isn't at all. And she certainly wasn't in the case of Rancé's own deep devotion to her and his own spirituality. And I'm going to tell you now a little bit of what that devotion was and how to reflect it in Rancé's own life.